okay? All right, so this is a position from a real game that happened in the 1800s. And in fact, in the game, White ended up losing the game, surprisingly. But they analyzed this game, they published it in a newspaper, and then someone said, wait a second, I have a way for black to draw. Now you may say, well, black's ahead of rook, right? White only has this pawn, right? But the pawn, the last move was the pawn pushed, and it's threatening to turn into a queen, okay? If the rook comes all the way back, uh-oh, the pawn's going to take the rook. So what does he do? Anywhere he goes, it looks like the pawn's going to queen. If he brings the rook over to the same line on c5, right, the king will simply take the rook. But he notices he can check the king. Now, if I bring the king up here, it's going to be a draw. Type in the chat if you can figure out how black can prevent white's pawn from turning into a queen. Again, these are the letters and numbers. The rook is on d6, okay? And white wants to push that pawn to a queen. What move can black play to prevent this from happening? Okay, let me know in the chat. d7, okay, very good. Rook d7 is correct. I can't push the pawn. The computer won't even let me do it. And the reason is because it's an illegal move. The king would be in check. Now when the king moves away, the rook can give itself up for the pawn, and we have a draw, king versus king. All right, so let's go back. So instead, white can play this very nice move, king to b5. Same problem for black. White's threatening to queen the pawn. If the rook comes over to this square, the king will simply be able to take it. Okay, so he checks again. Now, I could play this move king c4, but that's a tragic mistake. See if you can find a great move for black here. Here's the problem. White is threatening to turn the pawn into a queen, and black's rook is under attack, okay? See if you can find the best move for black. You can type it in the chat. Rook to c5. Well, rook to c5 checks the king and attacks the pawn, but uh-oh, the king will take the rook. Good try. Okay, try again. I'll give you a clue, though. The king and the newly formed queen will be on the same file. So notice that if white queens the pawn, it's not with a check. Therefore, black can play something very strong afterwards. Okay, I haven't seen it. Oh, somebody spotted it. Very good. Rook to d1. Awesome. Now, why is that good? Well, when the pawn turns into a queen, the rook can check the king. The king must move out of check, and then black's going to go and win the game. Okay, and if white doesn't promote the pawn, right, maybe they realize this and can move the king, well, then black can at least get the rook on the same file. White will be able to protect the pawn, but then black can sacrifice the rook for the pawn, and now this is again a draw. Okay, let's go back. So, too early to attack the rook. Best move, the king moves to b4. Well, what to do for black? Check the king. White goes down again. Check the king. But now white has a great move. King c2. And notice that the king is guarding that square so that the rook can't come underneath anymore. The king will simply be able to take the rook. Okay? So now the threat of queening is very real. And this square, the pawn is guarding. So it looks like lights out. It looks like the side playing black is lost here. Okay? So if we go back here, let me just take the arrows off so you can concentrate. Whoops. It's not letting me take the arrows off. That's frustrating. Okay, here we go. Oh my God. All right. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties here. Let me see if I can get rid of this thing. Okay, so it looks like black is completely lost in this position. But somebody came up with an unbelievable move and wrote this move into the newspaper. Remember, this was a game from the 1800s that was published on a weekly newspaper, Chess column. And the next week, the editor published this unbelievable move for black to draw the game. See if you can find it. Black's turn to move. We know white's trying to queen the pawn. We know white's going to take the rook if the rook stays there. So if you can, type a move in the chat. Give you another minute there. Okay. So we're trying to find a good move for black. Yeah, this is quite difficult. All right, I'm going to show you. So the move for black was rook to d4, which doesn't seem like it does much. But if white turns this pawn into a queen, amazingly, black can check the king, attack the queen. Now I know what you're going to say. Well, why doesn't the queen just take the rook? Stalemate. I can't move to a2. I can't move to b2. I can't move to b1. The game has frozen. I can't move. Now, what is stalemate? Okay, a lot of people misunderstand this term. Well, stalemate is close to checkmate, but here's the big difference. I'm not actually in check. My king is not attacked by any of white's pieces, but every square that I try to go to is. And I can't voluntarily put my own king in check. So the game has frozen. I legally cannot make a move, and I'm not in check at the moment. So the game ends as a draw, even though white is ahead a whole queen. And that looked like the article was settled there, and it looked like with correct play, black's going to be able to get this stalemate. But then all of a sudden, a month later, somebody wrote into the paper and said, I have a solution. White can actually win this game. So we know if they turn the pawn into a queen, black can give up the rook, and the queen takes the rook. It's a stalemate. So what are they talking about? How does white win here? And again, this took a month after being published for anybody to figure out. Okay? But see if you can do it in this stream. White to move and come up with a great move to win the game. Type in the chat. Okay, so Andrew says king c3. And Micah says king c3. Okay, these are great ideas. You're attacking the rook and still keeping the pressure on trying to queen the pawn. But here's the problem, guys. I can play the move rook d1. And when you turn that pawn into a queen, check. When the king moves, I can take the queen. Okay, and if he doesn't queen the pawn and he plays king c2, I'll bring the rook back to d4, and then when you queen, check again, and if you take the rook, stalemate. And if you don't take the rook, I'll take your queen. Okay, good try. So I think this is our position. Someone wrote king b3. Okay, that's an idea too, king b3. Let's look at that move. So king b3 looks good, but now I think we're repeating moves because I was already there before and I was checking the king, right? In fact, the king had come from b3 to c2. So if you go back to b3, right, then I'll just check you again. Okay, so here's where we are. Ooh, Edward says promote to a rook. Also, somebody else said promote to a rook. That's wonderful. You guys got it. Awesome. Let me just put this in here. So promoting to a rook. Now, why does that work? Well, here's the threat. By promoting to a rook, he's threatening to bring the rook to a8, which is going to be checkmate. Okay? If the king moves, right? So the king only has one legal square to go to. b2 and c2, no good. The king goes to a2, check. The rook has to block, mate. Also, the idea of rook c4 doesn't work because now on rook takes rook, the rook is not a queen. So it's not guarding the a2 square. The king can go to a2, so it's not a stalemate, checkmate. Okay, so this is what we call underpromotion. However, it was pointed out that the rook can go to a4. In fact, that's the only move that prevents the rook from checkmating the king. Find the next move. Whoops, sorry guys. All right, so white's turn to move. They both have rooks. It doesn't look like it's any advantage, right? Black's defended beautifully. Here's the big problem. The king is in the corner. It's a dangerous place to be. Ah, very good, Micah. King to b3, attacking the rook. Okay, so the rook is in danger, must move or be taken. And right, if the king moves, then we'll take the rook for free. And wherever the rook moves to, checkmate to follow. Okay, pretty cool finish. If the rook blocks, then we can take the rook. It's not stalemate. The king would move. We can play a waiting move. The king moves away. Checkmate, we win. All right, so how did we get here? Let's recap. Whew. So here was the position, the pawn push, threatening to queen. Black checks the king. White doesn't want to play the wrong move because then the rook will pin the pawn and sacrifice itself for the draw. So the king comes down. Check, king comes down. Check again, king comes down. Check for a third time, king comes down. Now, at the very moment you think you're about to win this game, you queen the pawn. Yikes, stalemate. But under promoting to a rook, which has a threat of checkmate, the other rook has to block it. And now you can have a double attack. You're attacking the rook and you're threatening to bring your rook to c1 for checkmate. He moves away, you win the game. All right, guys.